Hello and welcome to our fireside chat, Investing in Forest and Landscape Restoration. Before we start, I'd like to welcome all of you to, we will be translating this into French, so there will be French and English channels for this fireside chat. So if you would like to go to the bottom of your Zoom panel and click on the globe to click either on the English or the French channel. And any technical questions or issues you have, please post those in the chat box, and we welcome any questions throughout the discussion in the question and answer box, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to go through those. So the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and the Landscape Finance Lab would like to welcome to this fireside chat to discuss the state of finance for forest and landscape restoration, including opportunities and challenges. We will be welcoming two experts, Edith Kiss and Esther Mutuma, to discuss key elements that are attractive to investors and what this means in reality, and sharing their experience and lessons learned. Edith Kiss is an investment and development director at Mirova Natural Capital and manages the EUR100m Althelia Climate Fund. She has over 15 years of experience in climate finance, carbon markets, and conservation finance impact investing, having worked in various financial institutions, carbon funds, and renewable energy companies across the globe. Esther Mutuma is an avid social entrepreneur, believing that using enterprise to improve livelihoods, and specializes in sustainably managing social impact investment in the international development arena. Esther joined Comanza in 2018 and is driving the company's expansion strategy, launching their value addition operations in central Kenya. So we welcome both Edith and Esther to share their experience and expertise and lessons learned on investing for forest and landscape restoration. So to start, Esther and Edith, Esther, if you'd like to put on your video, if you are able to, please.
The host needs to allow me to do that. Sorry.
Okay. I think Disha, if you could address that, and maybe we will get started the discussion. There we are. Esther, I think you should be able to do that now. There we are. Welcome both. So at the local scale, to access to finance remains a challenge for many reasons. So I wondered if you could speak of some of the challenges you've seen from your experience with that, please. So this is to Esther and to Edith.
Hi. First of all, thanks, Lucy, and hi, Esther. Nice to be joining this panel today. Esther, would you like to start from your experience with Comanza?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Edith. And basically, I would like to start with saying the biggest challenge has been really around, first of all, getting the cash flowing into these projects, to the project developers. It's taken a very long time, 18 to 24 months to just even get into the right pipeline. And once you get into the right pipeline, then there's the question of, making sure that you're aligned to what the investors are looking for. And that's a lot of work. It's a lot of systems building and development. It's a lot of proving that the concept is actually viable. And that also costs money. If you think about just due diligence, for instance, to get a bankable project to scale, or to even get the right investors talking to you, you're talking about spending in upwards of $200,000 just to get due diligence done and to actually prove that the concept works. So that has been one of the major challenges, besides so many others, operational complexities and policy issues around the environment in which we operate, which we can develop further. But yeah, just to get the conversation going, I think Edith, those are some of the major highlights.
That's a fair point. And well, I would say that maybe just on a bit macro level, indeed, there is, I think, a lot of growing commitments and growing financial, at least commitments. It's not flowing yet completely, but we hope that it starts to flow soon as well. Two, I would say nature-based solution more broadly, of which obviously restoration is one of the key components. But it's true that just by the fact of investors or even governments commit, it doesn't mean that it's easy or it will flow directly to especially to the ground. So I agree with that, and I think we can see it in both sides. For example, if you look at the Great Green Wall initiative, how much money has been pledged, I think in the 14 billion, something like that, if I've seen the last numbers correct. And it doesn't mean that it's immediately available. It has a lot of structuring needs to be taken place. So that just by the fact it's indeed not so easy. And the other point you mentioned, Esther, which is very valid, that even investors who are ready to invest, so even if once the commitments come and investment vehicles invest, there is a big hurdle for projects, especially for larger vehicles who like typical investment vehicles who look at 5 to 10 million as a minimum ticket size. To get to that level, there is a lot of work that needs to be done. So I think the investment eligibility criteria and that you mentioned, due diligence is a key challenge, and I think there are some ways to work around that, and we have seen solutions around technical assistance facilities, incubators, accelerators. I think there needs to be done more because we need to accelerate the rate of the flow flowing to the ground.
And talking of these existing commitments, financial commitments, so we're aware that there's a lot of climate finance out there in these commitments. So what is needed to grow the individual projects to scale and profitability? So what is needed to make it attractive to commercial investors, I suppose, from your side, Edith, and from an investor's perspective, what is needed?
So it's a complex question, good question, and I would maybe just to take a step back, emphasize that as discussed, there is I think a huge momentum and growth behind nature-based solutions, and the main driver, or one of the main drivers, carbon finance, is the voluntary carbon markets. We do see a growing interest around the biodiversity thematics, conservation more broadly, and SDGs, but the big move which we have been seeing accelerating is around carbon. So I think the good news around that is that if for projects that are actually quite have a lot of carbon pools, carbon sinks, or attractive from a carbon perspective, I think they are able to attract actually quite quickly nowadays finance. And there it's more the question of how do you scale those, so the challenge of how do you scale those to the next level, which if you talk about RED+, for example, is around jurisdictional issue, which you can go into that. If you talk about restoration is I think we just need to be mindful of the fact that we have seen a flurry of capital also into large, more like plantation type of activities, which actually can be quite delicate around biodiversity. You want to make sure it's fully balanced and it's not just a carbon play, but it's also more holistic impact driven approach. And then if you look at others, we have seen many landscapes, especially in Africa, but also Asia, elsewhere, where carbon is can be an important element, but it's not enough because there's a broader ecosystem service play or some broader challenges. And there you need to have the multiple revenue stream model, which we have been testing, for example, with Althelia Climate Fund is very important. And those remain more challenging and more complex. And I think that is also adding to that due diligence issues and a bit more slower to structure. So that there are different elements to this.
Thank you. And apart from the finance perspective, are there any other promising incentive mechanisms, such as payments for ecosystem services, or and where with these other promising incentives, have you seen opportunities from your experience in Comanza and beyond, Esther? That if carbon, for example, is not enough in certain projects, what other incentives and can be used?
Yeah, great. So carbon is actually a great incentive, especially in this part of the world where there is so much potential to do relatively huge carbon projects that have very great social impact. If you think about some of the landscapes like the Assals regions or even the mangroves ecosystems. So carbon remains a really big incentive from a international perspective. But even locally and regionally, some of the things that need to be embedded around the policy that's being developed on REDD+, is even just local incentives for corporations and companies that would be interested in, doing a local market kind of approach to buying their carbon offsets from locally led initiatives. I think there's an opportunity for governments to step in there and bring in some policy incentives from even just tax-related, policy-related incentives that would encourage, corporations, the big multinational corporations operating in the region to actually also get involved to kickstart things and get a lot more projects going. So I think that's one thing that government can look at, policy-related, tax-related incentives.
And could insurance models be tailored in areas under restoration as an incentive as well for local communities to protect the rehabilitated spaces?
Absolutely, because again, with some of the challenges that we face, like droughts or floods, that are really out of control for the project developers or even the implementers. In this case, mostly the farmers. And there hasn't been pretty much of a development in the insurance sector to look into that. There has been a few projects that have been tried out, but there isn't, especially in the landscapes and forestry space, there hasn't been any proper product that's been developed to just purely address that. And it would be interesting to see if that's an opportunity right there to get people going and kind of like give them a kind of like an incentive. That would be an incentive for them to carry on and think through because again, the longevity of the projects you're talking about, 6, 8, 10 years, 15 years, is a very long time, even for a smallholder farmer to wait. So yeah, absolutely. Insurance should be one of the things that is looked at as an incentive.
And Edith, do you see any other opportunities for investment in this space as well from an investor perspective?
Yes, I agree with Esther that right now carbon is, I think, the easiest and also the most mature payment for ecosystem services. We do see there are some precedents, and I think, for example, biodiversity net gain or biodiversity offsetting, more like localized, localized context like mitigation banking. We have some good examples, I think, mostly in the developed world, but others like Colombia and somewhere. So I think there is some and then, for example, other ones like watershed payments. There's a system in Peru. We have seen that in Australia, and so there could be others. It takes time. So if you look at the carbon, how much time it took to structure it well, and also because of its nature to be global, these other ones might be much more tailor-made to local, which is also interesting and important. I think with the looking at the again outlook a little bit, what's happening under the CBD COP, hopefully looking at some quantifiable targets similar to the UNFCCC Paris style targets and climate. I think there will be a lot of potential for this new type of payment for ecosystem services around biodiversity, hopefully. We have been looking at a new tool published by IUCN around IUCN red list species, which is called STAR, a species threat abatement recovery tool, which allows at the moment more like the project screening and selection and design, but really to look into the threats around the species extinction risk. And I would say for now, these additional elements are more likely to be monetized as a co-benefit for a carbon. But over time, I think there should be opportunities to develop these as a separate so-called environmental assets or other payments types. So then definitely would be a good opportunity for larger landscape approaches also, where you have different drivers and different impacts that you're looking to address.
And I think this sort of feeds on from that question, and it's something that you mentioned as well, Esther, about the policy incentives that may be lacking in these initiatives or in these projects, that from your experience, what governance structures need to be in place for investors to feel confident to invest in these spaces as well? That's for you, Edith.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, goes back a bit to the due diligence questions as well, and actually on the landscape level investing, which I can also elaborate a bit on the scale. We skipped a bit over that one. So I would say that the first and most important like criteria for an investor to invest is to have the say counterparty or project proponent, and especially for landscape type of interventions, or which we have seen like many projects or like ideas or initiatives where there's a great idea and maybe there is an NGO coming up with an interesting solution for a certain sector, could it be cocoa or other. But then when it comes to structuring a financing, there is nobody able to take out, or let's say take that project proponent role and take out the financing. Financing can be a liability on your balance sheet. So typically NGOs, you can take obviously equity, even sometimes loans. They don't wanna take that on their balance sheet. So I think that's the very first question. Especially again, I emphasize for a carbon project, it's relatively straightforward. Although of course you need to look at, is it governmental and is it community owned, who is gonna, so there is a lot of structuring issues around that too. But also landscape level one, where you have different multiple revenue streams. Who is the proponent? Who am I financing? Who is the benefit sharing with? That's the key question, which we often have seen that is the major block in many nice ideas. And so that's what we would encourage local entrepreneurs and parties to think about that. And I would also say that that's actually one of the most important key success factor, that you have local ownership. We have seen also too often programs and grant driven kind of initiatives where there are a lot of consultants brought in, hired, and who come up with a nice business plan. But again, if there's not a local entrepreneur or local NGO or somebody who's implementing, then it's high risk. It's not feasible for an investor. So that's kind of for us the key starting point.
I suppose that I was going to feed into you, Esther, as well, from your experience. What has been, I suppose, the key elements of governance structures that you found useful from your side in attracting investment, and where do you see the potential for small holders to benefit from this scale of finance as well, given if you have these governance structures in place?
Yeah, I would echo Edith's perspective that it ought to be, for it to be really successful, it needs to have quite a bit of support from the locals, especially if in the case of where land belongs to government, for example, then you've got to have some sort of government approvals or concessions or some arrangement in place to make sure that there's security of tenure of the assets that are developed on those landscapes. By and large, one of the bigger challenges that has led a lot of the maybe smaller locally led initiatives not to see the light of day is that to be able to attract significant amounts of capital, your project needs to be super scalable and super big. And to get a project to scale, just putting together the systems, putting together the proof of concept, it costs money and it takes time. So a lot of times, people die before they actually take off. They had a great idea, they started it out, they got a grant here, a grant there, but it never really quite moved to a bankable project or a bankable idea because it wasn't enough in terms of technical assistance also. And in these landscapes whether carbon or forestry, it takes a long time to actually see results. If you're talking about trees and talking about 6 to 8 years, then you've got to have a patient enough investor to want to be willing to look into the future and not be worried about your cash flows now or your balance sheet now or what your revenues are looking like right now. Of course, there's need for projects to become innovative enough to try and get cash flows earlier on in the business and try to bring in ideas around brownfield models and approaches to generating revenue maybe trying with what's already existing, because there's nothing that's, a lot of the innovations actually have been there. And when I talk about this, I like to use the example of KTD and the tea sector in Kenya. It's a classic example of great patience from government for 10 years to develop, of course, with a lot of support from the international funders and financiers. But it took a long time to get together 500,000 farmers planting the tea and getting everything ready for the factories to come on and actually now start doing the processing. So from a landscapes approach on forestry or carbon, we've got to have those kinds of facilities and resources that might not necessarily be commercial money, because commercial money will not be very like patient to say, oh, I'm going to give you money and wait 10, 15 years. So they still need to up on the grants and kind of seed money. And I've seen a lot of, $100,000 grants out there to a proof of concept and initial idea. But $100,000 is such little money for a properly bankable idea that can now attract millions of dollars later. You've got to do maybe 300,000 to 500,000 and kind of bring it forward by not taking 5 years to do proof of concept, because the monies are so small that you actually cannot run faster and get quicker results to be able to establish a bankable idea. So I think there's a mix of, yes, governance, local institution, of course the investors can have something in it, but then if there's nothing in the first place, you have nothing to give if you've got nothing. So I think there's room to develop the grant space and the technical assistance space to a lot more than just 100K of a grant here, 200K of a grant there. And I say that with a lot of experience in this, because it took Komaza, for instance, about 10 years just living off grant money before they could actually transition to a commercial enterprise that could now start attracting investors. And I saw that in my past experience before Komaza. So it's kind of an obvious trend. And my appeal would be, really, let's look at this from a different perspective in terms of evaluating the innovations and the bankable ideas that project developers are working on, and be ready to invest upfront with them and take the risk upfront with them to make it big and scalable, because the opportunities are there, the potential is there.
And from the concept, I like the concept of patient investors. As a patient investor, Edith, how would you assess that these investments are working? Obviously, what Esther was saying, that different investors, depending if we're looking at investment of the initial to proof of concept to these longer term investments, because obviously with landscape restoration, we're looking at the long term as well as the larger scale. So how, as an investor, would you assess that this your investment is working? What are you looking to track, and how would you measure impact? Would it be, for example, you're measuring the fact that you do have a proof of concept and ready to take it to the next stage, or would you be looking for something more long term?
Yeah, I'll get on to that. It's just to follow up on Esther's comments. I think that's a very important point, and I think we have seen that exactly the same experience. And one of the challenges of most of these also like incubators, accelerators out there is that if they are not linked to the investment criteria of specific funds, then even though there are some that actually now give even up to 500,000, I think, more and more. If you look at, I think, a Convergence platform has some in Asia. There is P4F, there are others. Then it's still hard for those who come out of that program. They kind of have to start from scratch. So we have been looking at how I think we need to create on this. Everybody's talking about this missing middle. There are a lot of missing middles in different processes, but there's certainly something that collectively needs to be done to so that we don't lose time. We don't really have any more time to lose. So I think that's one of the areas we have been looking at on our side as well. I mean, what has been happening compared to, for example, our first generation funds like Althelia Climate Fund and the newer ones like the Land Degradation Neutrality fund is bespoke TA facilities. So that's one solution a fund can do if it's able to raise some junior capital and some donor funding that it's linked to the itself. Then to the fund and their criteria already upfront. It might have with certain aspects, it might not have with all the aspects that we discussed. Otherwise, I think what we have been trying to do on our side, also looking at our newer funds, whether we can a bit flex these kind of quite rigid criteria. So for example, with our latest fund, the L'Oréal Fund for Nature Regeneration, which is a dedicated vehicle with L'Oréal, we have been able to go a bit more early stage. The idea was for the fund actually be structured to lower the ticket size to 1 million from 5, to be a more early stage, to come in a bit earlier. And I think that's also because your impact is bigger there, because you can still shape much more how the project is structured. So we have been, for example, working on going down to feasibility level on a blue carbon side, which is new to us, and it's a bit of a challenge, but yeah, we have challenged ourselves to see how that can go and how it can accelerate that pathway. And we have been working on other bespoke solutions as well. For example, with IUCN on a kind of an accelerator, still an investment fund, but exactly this kind of principle where ticket size is lower. And you basically a bit chop up the process so that we bring in a bit earlier some very promising projects and accompanying them. It has been a very important part of anyway the way we operated, like co-building the projects. But again, as Esther also confirmed, it has required a certain level of maturity, and it's no surprise that our first portfolio was very focused on Latin America, where it was a bit more opportunities, it was a bit more mature, for example, also for Red Plus, from land tenure, from private sector. And that's, I think it's very important because Asia is now, I think, moving quite fast as well as Africa, but still we have to do much more there and have these kind of solutions, I think. On the impact, or like how we evaluate. So I think these are indeed long-term projects, long-term investments. We started with 8 years, now mostly 10 or 15-year horizon our funds looking at. So we know that we are there for the long term. I would say it's very important first to understand what's the theory of change. So as an impact investor, obviously we going there where the impact is. And we have our own impact framework that we developed actually before the SDGs framework even was published. Now we have mapped it around and we updating it and it's evolving. But the idea is that we understand at the outset what is the project's impact. We have funds that are more focused on climate, some more focused on land degradation, neutrality goals, or biodiversity. So we need to understand that. Obviously, we need to then see how the financing works and make sure that those are also solid and again, we have room, we have patient capital, so it's not to break even tomorrow, but need to understand on top of the impact the financials, and then by way of structuring. So none of our funding is like an upfront. Very rarely, like some are more a bit front loaded with equity or capex, but it's mostly like the way already the financing is structured is on milestones. Typically, if you have a loan. If it's a carbon-backed instruments, also can very nicely be tailored. It is nice because it keeps the projects also on track with this kind of payment for performance. It mitigates the risks and it helps scale the project. So that's the way we do. It can go for, we have projects where we have been disbursing along the full life of the project to even take out the OPEX risk, and then as the revenues come in, that's being reimbursing, and then the benefits is shared. So I think in that sense, we have this even quarterly kind of monitoring of all our projects. They report on financial, technical, and ESG matters. And then on the impact side, based on the pre-agreed KPIs, there is an annual reporting requirements, and based on that, we are able to annually report the impacts of each project, each fund, and then also trying hopefully on aggregated on a company level. So that's the framework we are using.
Thank you. And so with all of these elements that we've discussed so far, what gives, and this is a question for both of you, perhaps from your experience with a case study, what gives you hope that the current upsurge of interest in the challenge to meet finance for restoration, given under the context of the UN Decade of Restoration for ecosystems, how will this lead to meaningful change at the large scale? I know that we've spoken about the significance of scale and how different funds, you know, can be, will attract different scales, or will be appropriate for different scales. But what gives you hope, and any landscape interventions that you have funded or secured finance for, and what are the opportunities to scale as well? This is a question to both of you.
Esther, would you like to start, or shall I?
Go ahead, Edith.
Yeah, thanks. So yes, I think it's again, if you have been working on this for a while, then it's definitely the momentum is have been building up. I think from a past few years, we have started. When we started off, it was quite hard. There was a lack of any kind of signal on this type of, you know, externalities, for example, this is carbon or others. When we started off, there was, for example, not a practice of blended finance either. We have seen also the quite interesting developments, how the scarce public funding, even philanthropic funding, is now being blended. I think that's a very powerful tool. We discussed that, you know, that with blended finance, investors can take more risk, they can go more early stage. So I think there are definitely good trends. And then the private sector commitments, I think it's really encouraging to see all these growing commitments. It's not surprising, I would say, because I think the fact is that we're running late, running really out of time. So I think there is really an emergency, and in that sense, it's, yeah, you can stay optimistic because you see that things are happening. The devil is in the detail, and I think we can do still better and go faster. The scale is, maybe I'll circle back on that. So I think it's important to go to scale, but especially what's happening on the carbon markets, it is also a bit of a risk because investors at the end cannot invest in national systems, not even jurisdictional ones. They can invest in projects, and so I think it's very important that we keep working on this. For example, RED+, we see the top-down UNFCCC process and the bottom-up voluntary process. It's now converging, which is great. But we should, you know, bear in mind the practicalities, and there is, yeah, money flowing now to the projects. From our perspective, the biggest challenge now is to make sure the baselines are harmonized, the so-called nesting process is achieved. I think it's even required now for restoration, NDCs, harmonization. All this needs to be sorted out. But in the meantime, it just everything has to be done at the same time. So a bit of a risk on the side that there is so much discussion around accounting rules and this and that, which is a real risk for projects to you know, get a bit pushed back, and like having contracts. I've heard so many projects complaining, like, how do you want me to sign a contract on a 10-year horizon about how I'm going to comply with Article 6? It's not possible. Of course, it's not possible. So I think on our side, we urge pragmatism. We think that it's important to go step by step. That's the journey, and continue the projects, going with a more robust baseline, integrate them into national jurisdictional systems, and hopefully over time, in the next 10 years, we'll see real jurisdictional plays, real landscape level plays. But again, as I mentioned, investors will need to interact with people on the ground and with projects on the ground. And so I'm in that sense, I'm optimistic that again, we haven't seen this kind of flurry of capital flowing in. Competition is growing, which is great to say new actors coming in play every week almost. And finally, what I feel very encouraged about is the fact that the climate and the biodiversity agenda is finally also converging. We have seen that in silos for too long. We have seen that sometimes it was even like a competition. Is it a biodiversity agenda? Is it like but I think we have now demonstrated there are examples where you can do both, how you can, again, with an impact, for example, approach, combine them, and then combine also with the multiple commodity or like a multiple revenue stream approach, zero deforestation agenda. So I think that's kind of collaboration and convergence around these targets are key to scale up and to do the proper landscape approach.
And from your side, Esther, what have been your opportunities, your experience of opportunities to scale up access to investment and also the impact of your projects through the finance as well?
Yeah, and so in addition to everything that Editor said, there's an obvious convergence and everyone is starting to collaborate more than to compete, which is a good thing. We're very excited that even in the local context, we are seeing the RED Plus projects being taken on very seriously with the Ministry of Environment. Some of the questions that were being raised is, should we wait for you to finish on the policy or should we go ahead and structure projects? And the answer was, you guys go ahead and we're going to try and make sure that all of the ideas that you're putting together are going to be incorporated in what becomes policy. So those are great pluses. But in addition to that, for me, it's a lot of different points that gives me hope. For one, the tropical climate is always attractive, and that's not going to change in the near future. Just being in the kind of this tropical climate where there's a lot of potential to get a lot done in terms of generating projects that are viable for carbon projects, for forestry, sustainable forestry projects, and working with smallholder farmers. Again, the rural communities are still very farm-like, like the opportunities there to continue leveraging on that. You have more than 70% of the rural communities already farming, so why not, take that on and turn it into something that's innovative, that brings them value, adds them value. We're talking about, in East Africa only, about a population of 500 million people, which is like 70% of Europe's population. So thinking about that in itself as an opportunity, the infrastructure development that's going to be going on, the need to support that infrastructure development in the coming years with local products, locally manufactured and made products, is a great opportunity. It's one great opportunity to do a carbon project. It's another great opportunity to permanently store carbon in products that are made, sustainably. So the opportunity is obviously there and it's big. And it would be nice if we can get the financiers and investors looking at what it takes to tap into this and kind of just taking the steps of faith like Mirova and others have done to really believe in the local projects that have been developed and actually finance them because the opportunity is so huge. 500 million people in about 4 or 5 countries with a growing population, that in itself is good enough reason to want to, pay attention to this region.
Thank you, Esther. I think that's sort of ending sort of our chat about on a quite a positive note about the key opportunities and how I think from both investors' side and also the project side that there are attempts to try and meet in the middle and how to work best together to meet each other's criteria, I suppose, to have higher impact on the ground. And we do have a few questions from participants. Perhaps I will start with this one from Constantine van Baar. So we always speak about the bankability of projects to gain investors for projects. But in his view, this will lead to greater complexity, which will hinder the fast and large-scale implementation of projects. So in his view, we should perhaps think more about how to expand NBS projects, including biodiversity issues, to impact investors, and also develop an effective and simple framework that global projects can adhere to. So I wonder what your thoughts on this idea that if we are to perhaps just focus on bankable projects, Does that create more complexity? Does it limit certain projects that don't necessarily have these large scalable bankability? My question to both of you, really.
Yeah, I mean, the bankability is, yeah, I mean, depends how you define, for sure, for impact, I mean, for any investor, but impact investors, where you want to be catalytic, it's important that what you finance itself, the project, has some kind of catalytic impact, either because it's replicable or because, you know, on that project level site, it's scalable. So I think that's inevitable. It doesn't mean that there are other type of projects or have no merits. It's just from an investment perspective. And then if you look at the bankability or like investment criteria, which we discussed in the beginning, indeed, from an investor perspective, you need to go through your due diligence and managing. We are not investors ourselves; we are fund managers, so we have fiduciary duties on those investors' funds. And you know, the importance of what which we have started off again in 2013 is that we were always saying that it's a financially market return kind of fund, because if you can have impact first, as I mentioned, we try to look at from an impact first, but it has to make financial return, because otherwise you're not going to bring the big capital, bring the big flows of capital in. So our aim is to scale, and our aim is to show it to the investors that actually it's possible to invest and actually make money, because we, unfortunately, yeah, that's how it is. It's a capitalistic world. We're not going to change that. So I think in that sense, it's very critical that, you know, projects have to be robust. How they get there, I think that's where are different options. I have seen one question around the financing instruments itself. So again, I think blending is very interesting. It can be done on a project level. It's quite burdensome, actually, because as a project, you need to get a big chunk of grant, and maybe then an investor really invest easier. We did manage to do one project like that in Peru with USAID, which is very interesting, that, you know, they match kind of a funding on project level. It's, I think, even more efficient if you do it in a fund level. So you have a bigger fund like the LDN, 200 million, and a certain share is junior. That means that the fund itself can take more risks. And then you can also innovate on the instruments. So when we started off, we knew that the traditional equity loan instruments, they are not suitable for these projects. So for example, what we have been doing, the Climate Fund is a carbon collateralized loan instrument, which is a loan technically, but actually it has an equity type of risk, because we took all the collateral of the carbon, which sometimes haven't even been created. So in that sense, you take the full equity risk of the project, and then the repayment of the loan is also prejudiced or linked to the sale of the generation of those carbon credits and the sale of those carbon credits, which was very unique back at the time when there was no carbon price. And I'm hoping, I mean, nowadays it's becoming more easier to be structured, and also just more simpler offtake agreements and prepayment structures around carbon. And then other instruments we have seen that could be very interesting is revenue sharing loans. So you share in the revenues, you share the risk of the project. So you don't want to put all the burden on the project, obviously. And I think that's the whole reason the traditional commercial investors are not in the space. So we can innovate around the instruments and share those risks indeed with the projects. And then the preparation of them and how you get to that level, I think, again, approaches varies, and we hope to achieve that with funds that have this kind of mission already to build a pipeline, to nurture the projects and do these kind of acceleration cycles like we're working on with IETA. And so I think there are different options, and the good news is there are a lot of solutions. We just need to keep being creative about it.
Thank you. And from your experience, Esther, have you found that the bankable projects has been the main focus of your access to finance, or have you been able to access finance through other means?
It's the bankable projects, because fundraising is tough. By the time you're getting to your top 5 people who are ready to actually sign a term sheet with you, you've probably talked to 100, maybe more. And so everyone is looking at how bankable is your idea. And sometimes, there is a disconnect between what to them looks like bankable and what to you looks like bankable. And a perfect example here is in the forestry sector, where generating revenues takes time. For instance, if you started a project today, whether it's carbon or forestry products, it will take you a bare minimum of 4 years to actually get anything going in terms of revenues. And so when the perspective of what are your cash flows looking like comes into play, then you automatically lose out, because you're not going to break even anytime soon is the reality. You might start getting some revenues coming in, but it will take time to actually get even to break even. So that approach to how bankable is an idea has been kind of like the stronghold. Like everyone wants to think about it like that. And then there's a disconnect on the side of some of the project developers, because they can see what the idea and what the vision is. They may not have all the answers at this point in time to explain to you why they believe this can grow very big, because there's a lot of market research that needs to be done. There's a lot of feasibility studies around some things, and they do not even have the resources to do that. A perfect example is, you think about the numbers we hear of in forestry for products, wood demand in Africa. So we know the figures say it's $30 billion by 2030 because of all the construction that needs to happen, because of the growing population and so on. Ask someone to actually validate that. And it's a whole project on its own. You probably need to give them another $100,000 to just prove to you that that is actually the case. So there needs to be a bit of a change in the approach to allow for innovation in this space, in the landscapes space, to allow innovation to take place and to let it happen and let it take its course. Because it has to, it cannot be pushed. It has to be natural. It has to it has to happen in the context, and it takes time. So I think that patience needs to be improved on. I think there's a little bit more patience required by people who have the money to spend for it, and just have faith that these projects are actually bankable. The fact that they don't have all the answers right now doesn't make them not bankable.
Thank you. And I think this feeds into another question about what more can DFIs and MDBs do to adjust their approaches to support these types of projects? So, and what is your advice on aggregation for private sector investors?
Edith, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear what you think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I honestly think there's room to aggregate the private sector and to kind of combine some of these smaller, medium-scale projects and look at it from a perspective of, okay, we have, say, 20 of these going on, which is the one or two that are most likely to be very successful and very impactful? Because we already have kind of a natural problem, kind of inherent in the system, that there's a lot of fragmentation already. There's a lot of informality in all sectors. That we have very many little players all over the place, and there's power in aggregation for sure. Because if you aggregate, then you are able to see the bigger picture sooner, as opposed to trying to do every small little project. So I wouldn't advocate for focusing on small, many projects, but I would advocate for focusing on like the big mover projects. Like, what are the best 3 projects in East Africa, for instance, that are best placed to deliver impact on scale? And I like thinking about successful models in the financial. My background is banking and finance, and I saw a lot of innovation happen in this space that changed the way the world thought about financial markets for the poor, and just transformed the entire sector by just getting one big organization that understood what they were doing and how they were going to approach the sector, and just turning it around and running with it. And now it's a topic of discussion. How did they do this, and how come they're so successful? So it's doable. It can be done with one mega, super big organization taking it and running with it and bringing everyone else on board.
Do you have anything to add, Edith?
Yeah, no, I agree on aggregation. I mean, I do see actually some trends about companies or entrepreneurs coming up with ideas to aggregate small projects on the ground. So I think there are merits on that, certainly for an investor perspective, that's helpful. On the DFIs and MDBs, I think it would be good to see, as I mentioned, blended finance, so like more taking a bit more risk maybe, and helping to bring in more private capital, because we do see that this still remains risky. It's a long term, so the tenors are long. So there is a role to play. If you look at what happened with the energy transition and renewable energy, I mean, all these banks like the World Bank and others have been playing a very important role. And if you look at what these DFIs have been doing on nature, has been much lagging behind. And now I think there is a bit of a catch up, but it would be good to see more. And also from the public funding is this blended capital is still, we have the same pain as you or projects on the same side, that in order to raise 100 million fund or 200, I mean, if you look at Aldi, and it takes 5 years, we don't have 5 years for every 200 million funds to raise, and these cycles that you spend so much time just to raise a fund, then you deploy, then you go again. We just don't have those tens of years now to wait. So I think what we would like to encourage is to see this happening faster, streamlining the processes, because if ultimately we can get more junior capital, then we can lower the risk, the risk for the other investors, and then we can go take even more risks for the early stage. So it could be a very virtuous cycle, and that's what we should be moving towards.
That's quite good. Interfeeding with another question that we have is whether, can you elaborate on what a better model of grants and technical assistance for restoration would look like? So if we're going to avoid the problem of smaller funds for 100,000, even if that's just to support the due diligence at the beginning of a project here and there, and projects that subsequently struggle to raise investment capital. So is there a better way of approaching this? I know you've mentioned the blended finance and increased collaboration across the sectors, but how could we address this issue?
So again, I think if you have a fund that has a bespoke technical assistance facility, and again, that has been very difficult to raise proper grant funding for that. So again, if you take another 3 years just for that, you probably will just not do that. So you can build that next to a fund, a technical assistance facility, or that's where I think we have been looking at. And even for funds where we have been designing for this missing middle, which I mentioned with IUCN and the Nature Plus Accelerator Fund, even there, I think it's an investment fund which is going to challenge itself to go much lower ticket size, earlier stage. It's not up and running yet, just to caveat that. We identified that, in that instance, IUCN would play that technical assistance facility role. And for example, which I mentioned around the biodiversity or other type of assets, it's just too early, or it's just too risky from the bravest investors to venture in. So you do need that kind of junior and blended capital, but it can be very catalytic if there is already an upfront a mission or a scope for that. So when a project engages, what's the pathway throughout up to securing that investment, rather than these as we discussed, these more disconcerted efforts. Having said that, it's very important to have all these, and there is, again, it's really encouraging to see all the different kind of incubators. Most recently, I have been involved looking at also like challenges like the WEF is running the Uplink Challenge for entrepreneurs. You have the Dutch government has a big program, the FCD, with a lot of grant capacity. So there are a lot, and I think what we need is to streamline or make this kind of partnerships or collaborations between investors, so that those projects that come out of one cohort from one acceleration, then they know where to go. And that's what we have been also mapping out and seeing which funds, how they can link into each other, and how we can create synergies and not multiplying the competition, but more like creating those synergies and efficiencies.
And do you have any comments as well, Esther?
No, I think it's well covered.
I think that feeds into another question we have about, and I am aware that we're running short of time, but how can responsible investors looking at developing quality projects with greater co-benefits compete with these perhaps less responsible investors who are perhaps able to move quicker and maybe provide less widely beneficial projects that satisfy the short term? Obviously with landscape forest and landscape restoration, our ultimate goal is a long-term outcome, but how do they compete with finance that perhaps satisfies the short-term individual or perhaps even political agendas, and should standards be developed to support that?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's one, and that's I mean, if you look at carbon and then high quality or lower quality, I hope that the market will itself kind of regulate, and there is clearly, I think, from buyers a preference on high quality. How you define that, how you keep that monitoring and verifying that, that's key. So standards have a role. Minimum standards are critical. Policies or like governments, we talked a little bit about the enabling conditions, because yeah, I mean, for any, as the market grows and grows with scale, of course, you can't just go to cherry pick the nicest and impact investors like to do the best of the best, but we have to grow the sector, and for that you need minimum standards. If you talk about competing with other sources which are unsustainable, well, that has been the story of our lives. I think we have been working on this. It's extremely difficult to compete with them because of to start with the subsidies, harmful subsidies, which I'm encouraged to read that will be one of the agenda of the CBD again, to eliminate them. It's just impossible if we are starting so far away because of the subsidies, because of the lack of recognition of these negative externalities. But as soon as you start having a carbon price, having put a price on, and then you have like a lack of market access, for example, what's happening around the zero deforestation, that you can't actually come to the European markets if you don't comply with certain criteria, then hopefully all those other pressure points will make the responsible investors able to compete. And I think that's the whole point of where we're going, hopefully also TNFD and TCFDs to align and make it more and more difficult for the unsustainable ones to compete, actually.
I think I'm very much, Esther, sorry, do you have anything further to add to Edith's comments there?
No, markets will do it, and the responsible investors will always also do it, because they're going to see the potential in projects that the not very responsible investors would not be very attracted to. So I think that there's a balancing act there that over time will balance out, and the right thing will happen.
That's quite a positive note, I think, to end on. I am aware we do have some more questions still, but we're running out of time right now, so the discussion and the question and answers will continue on the D group. The link will come up shortly in the chat, and we welcome all of you, if you're not a member of the D group, to please come join, continue the discussion. Edith and Esther will be able to answer a few more of your questions on there. I think this is quite an interesting topic that I think more questions will emerge as you keep answering them. I have a few key takeaways, I think, that we gained from this discussion from Edith and Esther, that how due diligence is key to these projects, certainly at the local level, but it also needs money, and quite a significant amount of money, and needs to be considered in any investment and project development. And there are some major stumbling blocks to this investment: the governance structures within some of the projects and development of local ownership. And also this concept, this question of scale, that in order to attract capital, you do need finance to support and develop the proof of concept to make it bankable. I know we've spoken a lot about this idea of bankable projects, and whether we're looking at short term and long term and when the return comes in, but how this also needs resources as well, and these patient investors, this idea and concept that keeps coming up. But there are many opportunities to develop. I know, Edith, you were talking about the development of some of your more adaptive and flexible funds, and going forward, how these can perhaps be more innovative to respond to the project needs on the ground. And also from the ground side, that we are now seeing these climate and biodiversity agendas converging to be more collaborative, and to create, I suppose, a more holistic approach, which can then support and hopefully develop a greater engagement with the private sector. I know from the public side, public programs as well, which can support the scaling up of these. And this, I suppose, feeds into a little bit more about this idea and concept of blended finance, how it is an important tool to enable the private sector to take on more risk, but how it is complex in itself and needs some thought process, I suppose, to develop. It can be quite burdensome at a project level, so scaling up it perhaps is a more important element to include. I think going forward, I don't know if Edith and Esther, you have any final comments that you would like to make about investment and how it can support finance on the ground for forest and landscape restoration.
I would just say that thanks a lot for joining us, and it was a really interesting from my point of view. Very much enjoyed the discussion, and you know where to find us, and we are here to continue the dialogue. I think this was just an interesting 1 hour, but hopefully, yeah, we can continue offline. And yeah, thanks again for organizing. It was a very, very nice experience.
Yeah, Lucy, thank you and the team for putting this together. This was really an awesome chat. And to the audience really is to say the potential is there. There's a lot of local expertise and you know how to get us, and let's keep the conversations going.
Thank you, and thank you again. Thank you to Edith and to Esther and to Disha and Gloria and Sandra behind the scenes as well. I think, yes, ending that on a very positive note about the key opportunities and the potential to innovate at the local level. And we welcome all of our participants to continue the discussion on our D groups. And thanks again to Edith and to Esther for your very interesting conversation. Thank you.